Cemetery, also known as the Banks Creek Primitive Baptist Church Cemetery, as this has been the burying ground of the Hodges family since 1872. Now, today, as my cousin Eugene was, we call it progging, he came across a headstone. We know it's Hodges because we see H-O-D. And it's got born in, and it's going to either be 1808 or 1806. Now, and this person died in 18, and I don't see what the last two dates are, but you can rest assured that I'm going to be digging some more. Y'all can rest it. Y'all can take that to the bank. We will figure out who this is eventually. Now, my first thought, is this the Thomas Hodge, who is the patriarch of the Hodges family, who first bought land in this area right after the Great Surrender and created this burying ground, and all this land around was originally Hodges land? So we shall look and see. Our records indicate that he was born around 1910, died in 1872. His wife, Fanny, both of them were members of Neville's Creek, was born in 1815 and died in 1910. Now, this Thomas Hodge left a will. So when he died, when his wife died in 1910, they read the will. And from that will, we made a lot of discoveries. One, they were brothers with three different names. One, there was the Hodges name. Two, there was the Hall. James Hall, who's buried over there, was a son of Thomas Hodges. He was sold into slavery to a Nathaniel Hodges, and so therefore he took the Hall's name. Well, Nathaniel Hall died, and his widow, Sarah, married a Brannon. So three of the original Hodges are known as Brannons. These were the three when Sherman came through and camped at the Neville's Creek Primitive Baptist Church in 1864 on his way to Savannah. Several formerly enslaved individuals followed Sherman to Savannah. Three of the brothers, Meshach, Nedrach, and Abednego, sons of Thomas Hodges, but known as Brannons, followed Sherman into Savannah and later ended up in Coahoma County, Mississippi. When I was doing research at the Bullock County Courthouse and found the will of Thomas Hodges, Sr., and many other papers, I found where, when the will was read and they were distributing the property, Elder Washington Hodge, who's buried there, was the administrator, my great-great-grandfather, of the estate. In that, Thomas Hodges left to his sons, the Brannons, who were in Mississippi, some of the properties from the land. Elder Washington Hodges took a train to Dobbs, Mississippi, was in Coahoma County, and carried, and those receipts are in the Bullock County Courthouse, and carried their monies from the farm to them. I wrote a paper called They Left with the Yankees, and I learned this story from a uncle, my great uncle Dougie Lee, who was a Primitive Baptist minister. I was interviewing him one day, and he said, you know, my grandfather had some brothers, and they left with the Yankees. Now, I thought that was a story of, we hear a lot of stories. But once I found the will, and I found the paper, and I saw the receipts and all of that, then I knew it was a true story, so that was the origin of my paper, They Left with the Yankees. So, Thomas Hodges, I'm suspecting this is him or somebody Hodges, but from the dates of it, I don't know anyone else that it could possibly be Thomas Hodges. Now, these were enslaved to Hardy B. Hodges and Moses Hodges. These are the white Hodges, because in 1866 and in late 1865, the Freedmen Bureau demanded that there would be a contract between former slaves and the slave owners, so that the slaves, the former enslaved, would not be taken advantage of. Those records we have at the Willow Hill Heritage and Renaissance Center, which define that relationship. So Thomas Hodge, his wife Fanny, and several of the children had a contract with Hardy B. Hodges' son, Moses, also known as Eli Washington Hodges, which is the same name as Washington Hodges. So really you will find that a lot of the formerly enslaved have the names of the former slave owners. So I'm going to do more research here, but I know that in this cemetery, many of the graves have been lost because they were dirt graves. They were heaped up, and with lawnmowers and tractors and everything, a lot of them were lost. When I was a kid, my grandmother brought us here to help take care of the cemetery. And part of my challenge right now is the restoration of the cemetery. And if you will look, you will see a lot of markers that I placed at the graves. I had my Uncle Dougie Lee, Mr. Dan Lee, who many of you know, and Cousin Della Hodges, that many of you know, who taught me where all these burial sites were, but yet they were not marked. So I took it on myself to mark those graves that they told me about. I drew pictures of them as it was explained to me, and then later on had the James R. Bourne Funeral Home to make some temporary markers for me. Our goal is, I'm working with Reagan Donaldson to create permanent markers for those buried here. So now let's walk down here and start down here.
I got to say,
Yes.
how much did the land go out? You don't have to argue on this way, that way.
Oh, it was around 200 acres of land. They had a lot of land. And like I said, this is all that's left.
Wow.
The same thing with the Munlin family.
Wow.
It's all gone. As the Great Migration and others took it away. So, I know that in this line that the early Hodges were buried. Their graves over time was lost. So because I didn't know exactly where they were, I put a couple of placeholders here for Fanny Hodges and Thomas Hodges, but now we've discovered something there that has my imagination. And we will do a little bit more research. Now, this is kind of an unfortunate story, because here is the grave of Zachariah Hodges. Zachariah Hodges was the son of Elder Washington Hodges and Eliza Saturday Riggs Hodges. He was one of the clerks of the Banks Creek Primitive Baptist Church, son of Elder Washington Hodges. In 1914, he was killed. His horse threw him out and he hit a stump, and he died from that unfortunate incident. This is the grave of Eliza Saturday Riggs Hodges, born around 1855, the wife of Elder Washington Hodges. She died in 1910, and Elder Washington Hodge later married again. Sad to say, this is where Elder Washington Hodge is buried, and I know this to be the fact because I verified this through several folk. One was buried on, the son was buried on one side of the mother, and then the husband was buried on the other side. Now we're going to have to do something to provide a grave for a gravestone for Elder Washington Hodges, because he was so important in the early Primitive Baptist Church. Now he was the second pastor of Banks Creek, was the first pastor of Old Bethel in 1882 when it started, and pastored until the 1920s. He died in 1924. So he is deserving of something else here. He was also the first clerk of the Mount Pleasant Association of Primitive Baptists and did that for a number of years. He was a learned man, even though he was enslaved. He knew how to read and write, and we have his signature. His father had a will, and in that will we see various places that he wrote. So Elder Washington Hodge, my great-great-grandfather, I have preserved your spot, and I want to call the names of these formerly enslaved. Elder Washington Hodges, we call your name.
Elder Washington Hodges,
we call your name.
Eliza Saturday Riggs Hodges, we call your name.
Elijah Saturday Riggs Hodges, we call your name.
Thomas Hodges the Senior, we call your name.
Thomas
Hodges Sr., we call your name.
Fanny Hodges, we call your name.
Fanny Hodges, we call your name.
So this whole section here has a lot of people from the era of slavery. It's been lost. Grave sites have been lost. And so I've found out from the seniors long before a lot of the old folk like Cousin Dan Lee died, and I got everything they knew. I got everything my Uncle Dougie knew and everything my grandmother knew who used to come to the cemetery. But all of them tell me they were buried all right. So all those formerly enslaved who are buried in unknown graves, we call your name.
All former slaves
Buried in unknown graves,
we call your name.
Okay, now this area here have 3 graves in it. Sarah Ann Hodges, some of the dates are a little off. My Uncle Dougie did those. She was born in 1870 actually, and Jonas was born in 1867. He died in 1937, but the dates are a little off. But Sarah Ann Hodges is the oldest daughter of Elder Washington Hodges. Okay. Now, all of the Hodges daughters had Ann's in their name. Sarah Ann, Susie Ann, Mary Ann, Fanny Ann. Every last one of the girls had Ann. So they love that name, Ann. Yeah. So this is my great-grandmother, Sarah Ann. Sarah Ann was an individual who loved to cook. She lived near where the Hazel Lovett's farm was, out near Statesboro, where Hazel and Fred Lovett lived. They had a house out there. And she had a huge table, and on Sundays, all of her children and grandchildren would be there, and they would cook a big Sunday meal. And so this is what we remember a lot about Sarah Ann Hodges, the oldest daughter of Elder Washington Hodges. Now, Jonas Lee, she married Jonas Lee. Jonas Lee's father was Cow Jack Lee, who was a black cowboy. He was the one that was from the Blitch area. They used to, over around Neville's Creek and other places, used to herd cattle. Remember, cattle didn't always have fences. They herd cattle from Bullock County, crossing the Ogeechee River into Savannah. He rode a mule. His daddy rode a horse. His daddy was born during the era of slavery in 1845. Cow Jack Lee, he was called, had 2 wives, and I don't know if you call it a mistress or whatever, but had children by 3 different women. Okay?
He's a bad dude.
And his 2 wives were sisters, Charlotte and Molly. Yes, had children by Charlotte, had children by Molly.
That's a
Then
bad
went
boy.
over to Scrivener County, across the river, and had another one. Mose Lee came through that line. All right, so
So wait a minute, 3 wives and a cockabye.
well, no, 2 wives. I don't know. We use those fancy terms, but during slavery days, you know, it was about love. Okay, it was about love, and so just to state that he had children by 3 different women, and so all of the children they had were brothers and sisters, and they loved each other. Here is Lolly, the only daughter of Jonas Lee and Sarah Ann Hodges. She died very early in 1934. Had heart drops, as we called it then, which is congestive heart failure. And so she left 4 children, and those 4 children were raised by the brothers and the sisters and that kind of thing. So my Uncle Dougie Lee built this little encase around it. Okay, now here is a grave. Unfortunately, somebody came out and stole the headpiece, but I do have a picture of it. This is the James Hall I was talking about, who is the brother of Elder Washington Hodges. But he was a slave of Nathaniel Hall. He died in 1898 and was born around 1835. And so we still have his headpiece, his foot piece, but they had all of his dates here, and I've got pictures of there for years. And one time I came out, I guess somebody's gonna have some Halloween fun or something, but they took that out. James Hall married Susan Riggs. Now you remember we talked about the Riggs, we talked about Isaac Riggs, Dan Riggs, whose place the Willie Hill School was. Well, you had Susan Riggs, she was the other sister. All of the Halls in Bullock County, Mann Hall, Cleve Hall, come from this line, and cousin John Thomas, your people, Ravenel Hall, came from this line as well. Ravenel is his great grandfather. So all of this James Hall mine, they really were Hodges though. The Hodges elder was their father, but because of the slave days, they were sold to different folk. They had different names, just like the Brannons. Those 3 was part of the Brannon. Now, Susan Hodges, she was a Hall. She married J. Bryant Hall. She was the sister of Sarah Ann Hodges, Elder Washington Hodges' daughter. She died in childbirth, so she and her baby is buried somewhere in this area. Susan Hodges, it was Susie Ann Hodges, who married J. Bryant Hall, and J. Bryant Hall later married Edith Donaldson, who was the sister of Amelia Donaldson, who was your great-grandmother. So all of this is then tied in together. He married that, and J. Bryant Hall went to New York City and lived there and had a family through Edith Donaldson. Okay? Now, some other names I want to call your attention to. Remember we talked about the Halls? Well, James Hall and Susan Riggs had a daughter named Eliza James Hall. Eliza James Hall married Adolphus Saturday. So those of you who have heard the Saturday names, a lot of them left this area as part of the Great Migration and went north. A lot of them settled in Cincinnati, Ohio. So Eliza James Hall and Adolphus Hall had a son named Brian Saturday. And they are in this area here.
So Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania and Jersey seem to be the areas that people, particularly people in this area, migrated to.
A lot of them migrated to Florida.
Okay.
Florida was an area they migrated, and ladies, several of them went to California as the West opened up more. But Ohio was a very, very common place. New York City, New Jersey, Philadelphia, all of those were areas that the Great Migration got our relatives here. I said they ate them up, and they went looking for new opportunities. And so this was the Eliza James Saturday I was talking about. Now in this area, you heard me talk about Martin Hodges, who is the brother of Elder Washington Hodges, who married Aaron Munlin's sister, Dinah Munlin. They are in this area. They were members of Banks Creek remember that Martin Hodges was one of the clerks, was one of the deacons, and he was one of the founding members. In 1879 of May, when they founded, it was Martin and Donna Munlin Hodges, Aaron and Lucinda Munden, and Moses Parrish from Okie Grove in Emmanuel County that first, after being constituted by Matthew Donaldson and M.F. Stubbs, they started the Banks Creek Primitive Baptist Church that they are here. Now, Thomas Hodge Jr. is brother to Washington Hodges and the son of Thomas Hodges, and we're going to see a Wallace Hodge over there, all brothers. That's why this is the Hodges Cemetery. He married Gracie Munlin, and that's Mr. Eugene Lane's people, because Gracie Munlin and Thomas Hodge had a son named Wesley Hodge, and Wesley Hodge is buried over there. And Wesley Hodge wrote a book on the history, a little pamphlet on the history of the Primitive Baptists. Now, he died early. He's one of the early deaths. And so let's call his name. Thomas Hodges, we call your name Junior.
Thomas Hodges Jr. Call your name.
Donna Munlin Hodges, we call your name.
Donna Munlin Hodges, we call your name.
Okay, and Martin Hodges, we call your name.
Martin Hodges, we call your name.
Now, there is some controversy as to the burial site of Gracie Munlin. Some say it's at Fish Trap, some say it's here. So we put this here next to her husband in honor of her. And Gracie Munlin was the sister of Aaron Munlin. Remember, she was one of the ones that came from South Carolina in 1856. And she was a little girl, and she married Thomas Hodges. So you see, a lot of the Munlins married the Hodges. So we just left the Munlin Cemetery, but this is the other aspect. Both are associated with the Banks Creek Primitive Baptist Church, and those there were related to the Saturdays. Eliza James Hall, daughter of James Hall, that's her and her family there. Okay?
But you know, it's a money. I always thought it was a money thing. Because those are the families that had wealth. They had land.
That makes sense.
They had land. And wealth, you know, was
Okay.
always going to marry wealth.
Now this is the wife of Deacon Wesley Hodges. Deacon Wesley Hodges is cousin Eugene's great-grandfather. And Moselle, great-great? Okay. Moselle Holloway, the daughter of Andy Holloway, related to all those Holloways, Jesse Holloway and all them other Holloways from Candler County, Georgia, died in 1924 during a measles epidemic. She died as a very young lady. Cousin Della Hodges, who was the daughter, who I interviewed extensively, tells me about how she had to then leave school and work because, you know, taking care of business at home because of the death of her mother. Several people caught the measles, but she was one of the few that died from that. Now, Elder Washington Hodges died over in Candler County. There was a caravan of horses that started in Candler County, came down the Meadow Road, through Portal, and then through Two Chop Road and brought him here to the cemetery. And I had many people to describe the caravan of horses in 1924 that was the death train that brought him here to this site. Elder Washington Hodges. Okay. Now this is Elder Washington Hodges, and these are his children. Henry Hodges, Melly Hodges, and John Hodges. These are all children of Wesley Hodges and Moselle Holloway. There is another grave here that belonged to Herman Hodges, and I don't know which one it is. But Herman Hodges left Bullock County Meadow area and went to Atlanta, Georgia, and worked at the Armour Fertilizer Company. This was in 1920. If you look at his death certificate, somebody murdered him at the place. They stabbed him. So we don't know why that was, but when I looked at it, he listed his death as a homicide. And the people that signed the death certificate were the administrators of the Armour Fertilizer Company in Atlanta, Georgia. And I heard Cousin Della talk a lot about that, okay? Now, I want to talk a little bit about these graves here because they weren't marked. Now, this is Deacon Wallace Hodge, brother of Washington Hodge, brother of Thomas Hodge. Now, Cousin Dan Lee showed me exactly where these graves were, and so I marked them. So this is where he's buried. We really do need to get a permanent mark for him. He had a dirt grave, and luckily we saved him, his gravesite. And he married Lucindy Coward. She was several years older than him. And Lily Bell is Cousin Dan Lee's daughter. And there's somebody named Cardell Lee, who is his son. These are all Cousin Dan Lee's people. Now, Wallace Hodges had several daughters. One named Louise Hodges, she married somebody named Green Hagen. All those Hagens in Portal, Georgia are originated from Green Hagen, and he had two sons named John and Jane Hagens. Wow. And Louise Hagen was the daughter of Wallace Hodge, who married Green Hagen. So there's your Hagen family in Portal, Georgia.
So the Hagens are connected to the Hodges?
Yes, that is correct. They're connected to the Hodges.
Did not know that.
And a lot of them don't know their own connections. And so that's why we've seen a lot of people not knowing who's who.
Yeah.
And you know what happens if you don't know who's who?
Yeah.
No more I will say. No more I will say. But a lot of these folk here are connected. Now, these love bugs, I love you too. I love all of y'all, but I would take your love somewhere else. Wow. Okay, now, so this whole section in here are going to be related to Lucindy Coward and Wallace Hodges. All of these lines here. This line here is related to Green Hagen, Green Hagen's children. Sonny Man Hagen, you've heard of that name, that's Green Hagen's son. Okay? And Sonny Man Hagen married Mamie Johnson, who was a Jackson. Mamie married Mamie Johnson. Okay, and Mamie Johnson's mother was a Jackson, who is connected to my family. Okay. All right, so all of these are connected. So I'm not going to go to each one of them, but I do want to call attention to Melinda Lee. She was the one I told you that was singing, walking down the road, daughter of Wallace Hodge. She was the only child of Wallace Hodge that survived. When he died, there was only one child living. There were several that all of them had died. Louise had died. Thomas Hodge had died. There was a Thomas Hodge, and there was a Robeson Hodge. All had gone. So I want to focus over here because a lot of these individuals over here are related to my family. Milton Lee, Washington Lee, Ida Mae, John Henry, and let's see, Ida Mae, John Henry, and Willie Mae. These were the children of Lolly, who died at 34, that I told you was raised by someone else. John Henry died tragically in 1947 on Christmas Day in an automobile accident. Okay? So he's there. They all were raised by Milton Lee, Washington Lee. This is Claudia Lee. And I want to call reference to Susie Mae Lee, who was only 8 years old when she died. And so she is being remembered, Susie Lee. That was Laws Lee daughter. Laws Lee and Elizabeth Cooper. This is Cotty McCullough, who married Benson Lee. Benson is buried in Miami, Florida, but she died in 1947 childbirth. This is the Doyle Halls. The Halls got mixed in, but they all are related. These are Cleve Hall's family. This is the Laws Lee I was talking about, Elizabeth Lee, his son Johnny Lee. Want to stop here for a minute? Because this is my grandmother and grandfather, the one who raised me when my mother died tragically when I was 17 months old by fire in 1951, December 17, 1951. My mother's dying wish was that her mother would take care of the three of us, and she did. So I was raised in the house around a lot of old people. That's how I got the stories. I used to listen to them talk. They used to be on the front porch talking about years gone by, Willow Hill School, the church, and all of that. And I found that a little more fascinating than shooting a basketball. So I listened. But this is Bonnie Mae Lee. She was a substitute teacher at the Willow Hill School. Solomon Lee, World War II. He was born in 1892. Wow. He went to France, and he was a chef. That was what his role was in the military. This is Cleveland Hall, Nellie Hall. They're related to the Joy Hall. That's their son. They are James Hall that I showed you over there. These are his grandchildren. Okay. This is my Uncle Rossell Lee, my mother's brother. He did not like the farm. So he went north. So he went to the field one day. He was out working with somebody, and he went to the man and told him to pay him. He paid him, and he hitchhiked to Savannah, Georgia. And we did not see him for 10 years. Wow. And I remember my grandmother said, "Oh, Lord, I wonder where my child is. I hope my child is not at the bottom of some river." And then he showed up. She came back. Somebody ran into him in Savannah and said, "You want to go see your mama." So they brought him down. They said he wasn't there an hour, just pacing. He said, "I got to get out of here. I got to get back." He said that if a mule was sitting in his lap, he wouldn't say, "Get up." Giddy up. You know you say giddy up when you tell a mule to go. Whoa, stop. Giddy up, let's go. He said if a mule was sitting in his lap, he wouldn't say giddy up. No, he didn't like that farm.
What did he end up doing in Savannah?
He worked at the fertilizer company.
Okay. If I ever get out of here, I'll go.
Okay, this is very special to me. This is my mother and my father. My mother was very young when she died in 1951, wasn't more than 19 years, 20 years old, had already had 3 children. She lived out in the rural, or turned her back to the fire when my dad had gotten up to go down to Savannah. They lived out in the country, Savannah, to work in the bomb factory from the Korean War. Dad luckily had not gotten on the bus yet, but he heard her holler and he came back up and he saw a ball of fire running down the road, going up to Blanche Neesmith and Charlie Neesmith, white people's house. She went up and asked for help, but Miss Neesmith was afraid to come out, so she threw a quilt out, but it went over her head. So Mom turned around and ran back toward her house. I was there, I was a baby. My sister and brother was in the house.
Mom.
My dad ran back, he took his hands and put her out. And then went back to the house where we were, with the 3 of us in something he said he zipped up. I reported that story. And so he went back and got Blanche Neesmith to take him to the Bullock County Hospital. There was no EMS then. So Blanche Neesmith had gotten up, had on a house coat, whatever. She had this car, and they brought the 3 of us over to our grandmother's house, and we never left after that moment. So Miss Neesmith was driving the car, and Dad said that little car, that little speed arm was on 100 miles an hour, just going, and she was just sitting there holding, honking her horn, driving. And Mom was saying, telling my dad, Miss Blanche let me get burned out. That's what she was saying. And Miss Blanche was saying, "Oh, honey, don't say that. Don't say that."
Okay.
And so that was kind of the story going on in the car. So they made it to the Bullock County Hospital. Of course, at that time, the hospitals were segregated. So you had the black ward. So they put her in, they wrapped her all up from the neck all the way down. That would not be the therapy now. So when the swelling comes, it wasn't the best thing, and they didn't have the same therapy. So she lived 6 hours after that, and she died. And my grandmother, who had just come out of the hospital, Mom kept saying, "Where is Mom? Can I talk to her?" So my grandmother was on her way, and just as she was walking in the front door, she said, "Where's Mom?" And they said, "Well, she's on her way." She said, "Oh, well, tell her to take care of my children, and died this lifetime. Rest in peace, Mama.
I wanted to say something. So, hey everybody. So this is actually my grandmother. I was named after her, so I have the same exact name, and it just brought a lot of emotion to me when my dad talked about her. I wish I was able to know. Wish I got a chance to meet her, but she died in her 20s. So the story was always very sad to me. Just glad to be able to learn these stories and to be able to remember her legacy and her history. So just wanted to say something.
Yeah, well, thank you. I really appreciate that. So I gave my daughter Mom's name so that Mom could be remembered. She lived such a short life, went to the Willow Hill School, and probably traveled not much outside of the Willow Hill School. Dad, who was World War II, came with an army suit on, all dapper, caught her attention.
Looking good.
Ooh, it was looking good. They said, I know Deacon Jackson was tall and handsome and stole her heart. So, but these are the stories, and these are the stories we have to tell so that folk will know what happened. And remember, this all happened during segregation. You couldn't be in the same hospital ward. You had to be this. You didn't have this, you didn't have that. Now, the Van Buren Hospital existed at that time because it was from 1918 when Dr. Harvey Van Buren first came to Bullock County during the flu epidemic, which he played an important role. So thank you so much for it. I gave you my mama's name.
Appreciate it.
And that Zeke Jackson, he was a joker. He used to like to harass my grandmother. And so one day he told her, he said, if you was a man, I'd take you on this morning. All right, let's finish over here. Now, okay, so you remembered I talked about Thomas Hodge Jr., who married Gracie Munlin. They had a daughter named Anne Jane Hodges, who married Albert Hendrix, who was the carpenter of the Willow Hill School. Albert Hendrix was also known, he's buried at Fish Trap now. This is his daughter. He also was known as the casket maker because a long time ago, before folk could afford caskets, they would get certain types of wood, they would bend the wood, the men would put it together, and then the women would line it. And so Albert Hendrix was one of the main casket makers in the county. His daughter, the granddaughter of Thomas Hodge Jr., this is Ada Hinton. She was born around 1899. There's some discrepancy about the date there. And I was able to interview her and to get a lot of information. This is her husband, Osborne Williams, who was about 20 years older than her. He was much older. He was born either in slavery or just outside of slavery, Osborne Williams. He is related to the Parrish family of the Willow Hill community. Moses Parrish, Andy Parrish, Lucinda Parrish. They had a sister named Harriet Parrish from which he came, Osborne Williams. And this was his second marriage. In fact, cousin Ada was around the same age as his children from the first marriage. And then you have James Williams, R.L. Williams. These are children of Ada Williams, and all of the others are grandchildren in this area. Ada Williams was a great historian, had a great memory, and her name or her oral recordings are in the Willow Hill archives. And this is a grave that just was buried not more than 2 weeks ago. Annie Bell Williams, who was the daughter of James Williams and Miss Clark. She was at the Willow Hill School when I was there. I believe she was born around 48. And her sister Katrina was in my class. Now, all of those graves to the right, remember I talked about Cal Jack Lee had another family. He went over to Scriven County. Well, Mose Lee was the product of that. And Mose Lee was brothers to all those other Lees. And all of this is their lineage. And Laura Lee, she was in my class up at Willow Hill, Relaford Lee. And there's a couple other relatives down there. Johnsons are all related to this family. So we want to thank you all for being a part of our cemetery. If these cemeteries could talk, I told y'all some stories today, didn't I?
Yeah.
All the stories they could tell. Want to give recognition to my wife, Dr. Gail Jackson, who is having some difficulty with mobility now, but just love the spirit of Willow Hill and working together. And she is so responsible for putting our programs together. And so I am so appreciative of you. And thank you so much for what you do. And Pastor, we thank you for letting us be a part of the Banks Creek Primitive Baptist Church Historic. Mr. Eugene Lane, we are so appreciative of you on the work you do in helping to keep the cemetery. Mr. Mosley, Mr. McFadder, and Mrs. McFadder, we thank y'all so much for the role y'all play. And Dr. Thorpe, we just thank you for being here as a historian to lay witness to history that many of us in Bullock County know very little about. So thank y'all so much, and we look forward to our next If These Cemeteries Could Talk series, where we will be at the Rehovia Missionary Baptist Church. And at this time, we will ask Pastor to give us the benediction.
Let's pray. Gracious God, we have been enlightened and enriched by the history we learned from our ancestors. Their legacy lives on through us. And Father God, we just pray that you continue to be with us now as we leave this place, but never your presence. We thank you for it and appreciate it. For us in Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. And Miss Geneva Donaldson Lee, who married Toady Relaford Lee, she's buried in that line. And so many of you from the Podal area would know Toady Lee. And they had a son named Toady too. Oh, so we got to mention her name, and really appreciative of what everyone did to make this what it is today. So thank you, and stay tuned.